afternoon, everybody. My name is Ian Povey-Hall, and welcome to our session on corporate investments in forestry and biodiversity. I work for an organisation called Acre Resources. We're a specialist recruitment firm focused on the sustainability space. We have a range of different divisions. I lead on sustainable finance and impact investing. So we work on any investment role, public and private markets. Some are on a spectrum of sustainability through to impact, as well as core subject matter experts that fit within centralised functions across our client base, which are banks, insurers, asset managers, family offices, private equity groups, and foundations. I'm based in London. The company is split between London, Amsterdam, and New York. And I'll just pass around to the panel to introduce themselves briefly and say a bit more about what they do. Edith, do you want to go first?
Thank you. Thanks, Ian. And good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Edith Kiss. I'm Investment and Development Director at Mirova Natural Capital, based in London. We are an impact investment asset management firm, an affiliate of Mirova and Natixis investment group. We have started on the journey of nature-based solutions in 2013 through our flagship Althea Climate Fund, which I'm managing. Still, it's coming to an end next year, and we have grown since then significantly. We have now 6 funds under asset management and a bit more than $500 million under asset management, and managing funds across thematic areas, forests, oceans, and soils, or sustainable agriculture. And biodiversity is a key theme across these thematic funds. So pleasure to be here and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Rachael?
Hi there, good to be here this afternoon. Rachael Nutter, so I'm the Director of Nature-Based Solutions at Climate Care, responsible for Climate Care's Nature-Based Solutions project development business. We work with corporate clients to provide customised portfolios of carbon projects, generally to help corporates with meeting their carbon neutral and net zero targets. So we're working with projects across the globe to deliver verified carbon credits to our clients and to develop new projects as well. And so we're really focused on high integrity carbon projects to deliver the units, but also to deliver the SDG impacts associated with those projects. We've been active in and formulating the voluntary carbon markets for the last 20 years, and recently announced our merger with one of our former competitors who's been in the business for as long as we have, Natural Capital Partners.
Cool. And Nabil?
Very good. Thank you, Ian. Good morning, everyone. I'm Nabil Fawaz. I am the sector manager for the agribusiness, manufacturing and services operations at the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, better known as MIGA. MIGA is a member of the World Bank Group, and we are the private sector arm of the World Bank to encourage foreign direct investments into developing member countries. And the way we go about it is by assisting investors in managing some of the non-commercial risks that they may face in their investments in developing countries when they are moving ahead. And we rely a lot on our World Bank Group colleagues, where we cooperate and collaborate with them to try to structure these investments along with the investors, and to foster good ENS standards, as well as a good relationship with the communities where they're investing. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. And so the first question I was keen to explore was just digging a bit further into each of your experience across this space, and looking at the kind of risks and opportunities that corporates need to understand and consider when looking to make investments in the forestry and biodiversity space. So we'll stick to the same order, and I'd be keen to get your thoughts on that point.
Right, so I'll kick off. Thanks, Jan. So I would start with maybe saying that we have seen in the nature-based solutions, which encompasses a bit maybe broader than just forestry but certainly biodiversity, an exponential growth in the past few years. And I'd say that it has been fueled by as a significant part by this wave of net zero commitments by corporates, obviously. and also by the growing recognition that, you know, to get to anywhere near the 1.5 degree Paris target, we need nature-based solutions as you know, as essential part of the toolbox. So that's been very encouraging, and again, I think that's a big driver behind. And also those translating into action. However, there is a lot of commitments, and if, according to different analyses, if all those commitments are actually translated into action, I think we can expect the market to grow 10 to 15 times more. So we are in, I would say, at the beginning of the journey. So obviously for corporates, what's interesting is that we have seen them purchasing, for example, nature-based, nature climate solutions, so basically carbon credits with high biodiversity attributes and from the nature-based sector. And then more interestingly, some of them, of course, went a step behind and started also going a bit more upstream, so investing in also this sector. So that's an interesting trend that we have seen coming along the journey. On our side, on Mirova side, so we're also working with corporates, and our most recent fund is the L'Oreal Fund for Nature Regeneration, which I wanted to mention because it has a little bit different angle, as it's an impact investing fund. So it's a corporate coming into the impact investment space with really the intention to do impact beyond its, you know, supply chain and its own footprint, recognizing that that's not maybe fast enough, or that there are other important, you know, key biodiversity areas, high carbon stock areas, which are not in the direct supply chain. So I think that's an interesting trend as well. And I would say as a type of capital, very complementary to financial investors. And hopefully we'll see these kind of trends as well to grow. Beyond carbon, I would say biodiversity is a broader, and nature is a broader kind of investment theme, which I think is coming as well and catching up. Obviously, you know, on climate, we have the Paris Agreement and targets. On biodiversity, we are lagging behind, but it's coming. Notably, the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure is in the making. So we do have, we do see that that's going to be hopefully a driver the same way as the TCFD was on the climate side, requiring, you know, corporates and also investors to do something about their biodiversity footprint, and in that sense, we'll need more biodiversity or nature-positive investments. So we do see this as again as a growing trend, and the opportunity is for corporates to get on this journey early, right, and not at the end. And so I think there is, there's a lot of opportunities, and a lot of companies are already moving, so it's an encouraging sign. So I'd stop there and happy to continue after the other panelists.
Cool, thank you, Edith. And just one thing I didn't mention at the beginning, please do ask questions. They'll appear in the chat, and we'll cover them either as we go, if they're particular to each of these points, or at the end we'll have time for direct questions for the panelists. But before we get to that, Rachael, what's your take on this point?
Yeah, I think everyone knows there's been an explosion of commitments from corporates, which is great. And as Edith said, now we want to see the action, and we see our sort of clients at the forefront are now, putting serious money behind this, and it's these are board level decisions and board level pressure to get things done, which is great news. I think a couple of the trends that we see in this area are the trend to not offsetting last year, this year, next year, but companies thinking 10, 20, 30 years out, and thinking about how they're going to secure that supply. So, the carbon neutral period being a mixture of carbon avoidance and carbon removal, i.e. conserving what we've got and planting new. We have, it's nuts to be planting if we're not protecting what we've already got, and that's really critical for the next 10 years. So, there's a period where clients are going to be doing both of those and really thinking about how to secure long-term credits, perhaps from existing projects. But the other trend we're seeing is clients wanting to invest in new projects, and in particular around carbon removals, i.e. planting projects, recognizing a couple of things. One, that with the amount of demand for removals credits, there aren't enough removals projects in the world to satisfy that demand right now. And that's partly because there haven't been the people prepared to pay, because it's more expensive. they haven't been prepared to pay and make those commitments over the period required and make the upfront investment required in planting before you get the carbon. So we're seeing a big appetite there for clients who, recognise that to know that they've got access to high integrity credits when they need them and not be at the mercy of a market price in 10 years' time. That's an investment that they're prepared to make. So that's a really big opportunity that we see for our clients. And alongside that, you've got all of the SDG and biodiversity impacts as well that clients are certainly looking to communicate. And as Edith said, I think those markets will evolve as well. At the moment, SDG impacts, the value of those tends to be wrapped into the carbon price, and clients will pay more for carbon with those attributes, and particularly things that perhaps resonate with their operations. But in time, it'll be interesting to see whether they become separate revenue streams and tradable assets in their own right. In terms of the risks, I think for large corporates, this is a very new area and a very new business for pretty much every corporate. Different risks, different counterparties. You're dealing with nature, you're dealing with communities, often quite remote communities, and that just comes with a whole bundle of reputational and delivery risks. I think we always come back to there are established standards, the projects are independently audited, and you can seek additional standards around some of those reputational aspects as well. So I think making sure that you've really done the due diligence on the partners and the projects, and making sure that projects are managed and the risks are managed over the life of that investment, and sort of keeping an eye on regulatory and political risks, there's international discussions going on and so on the whole time. But in the meantime, we need to get going and as Edith said, take action on putting money on the ground and money into communities to protect and develop, restore ecosystems. So I think, yeah, it's an amazing time. I mean, it's just exploded this year. It really has.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's, on what you're the pricing point you're mentioning, that's also a risk as well, right? A risk of inaction, which means they're having to come in at a far less competitive pricing point. And so, I think that will catalyze activity at the same time as a function of that increased appetite from corporates that we've seen in the last year and a half, which is, we're seeing that across the board. There's an exponential interest, but also frustration around actually executing in this space. Nabil, do you want to come in on that as well and just give us your view around the risks and opportunities from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely, Ian. Thank you. And I completely agree also with Edith and Rachael on basically from MIGA's perspective, we have been very much involved in agribusiness space and the agro-processing, agriculture itself. We haven't reached a lot of depth into the agro-forestry side, if you'd like. However, interestingly enough, that over the past year and a half, 2 years, we have been seeing an increase in inquiries internally at MIGA with regard to forestry and carbon credit investments, and from various parties, from corporate to private equity funds to private that are looking into the space. So definitely there is an increase in that space, and especially now, I mean, the World Bank in general and MIGA also are pushing heavily on the climate and investments and the climate impact investments, and we are looking more to have all our transactions and projects to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. So we are trying to push over the next few years to drive more of the transactions and projects to make them Paris aligned, and to work with the investors on how they can make these investments aligned with the Paris Agreement. And on the forestry side and in that space also, what is important on the risk perspective, that these investments tend to be long term. So the investors are looking into very long term investments. So these tend to be 10, 15, 20 years, and the risk risks at this very long horizon tend to be unknown. And for many investors moving into developing countries where, you know, the land laws are not too clear, are opaque, where the land ownership is also not too clear, where the investment laws, the ability to transfer money or to convert the local currency into forex to repatriate their earnings is unknown or could change. So they view these risks with caution, and they are always worried on proceeding. So the idea here is that there are instruments in the market, both in the private sector as well as in the development finance institutions, such as in MIGA's side, where we can, where there is support and guarantees, where they can ensure these investments against the unforeseen actions from governments in the future that may cause losses on their investments, be it in the transfer restrictions of currency, be it takeover of the assets as an expropriation claim, or be it as a lease agreement, a breach of contractual agreement that they may have with in the country. Or you know, the unforeseen disturbances that may erupt in a country and may cause losses to these investments. So investors are concerned about these non-commercial risks and have been approaching MIGA, especially for these ability to cover these investments, and specifically on the long-term nature that they take on that front. Thank you.
We've just got a question that's come in here from Thomas, just kind of summarising it now, but I think it alludes to one point that I wanted to raise around the subsidy side of this, and if anyone wants the panel wants to come in on, you know, how much of a risk or opportunity that represents, either in existing subsidies that governments and other public sector actors are putting into this space to catalyse action, or if there's a timing piece around subsidies that are coming up that will affect whether you would invest at this point or at some point in the future. Then maybe that potentially links into his question around, you know, what other type of actors need to be involved in the sync beyond the corporate themselves, from both the investor side, but also public sector bodies in type of, you know, blended finance type situations. Edith, do you want to?
Yeah, maybe on the blended finance, a very good point. I mean, subsidies, we could talk about perverse subsidies. That is one of the major hurdles for nature-based solutions. But I think the question was more on how we could use scarce, you know, get more and more scarce public resources to catalyze the sector further. Indeed, blended finance models are a good way. It's still, as we discussed, I think both Nabil and Rachael, it remains very risky. We're talking about emerging countries, we're talking about long-term horizon. So I think there is a really good way to use these public resources in a catalytic manner. We have seen also exponential growth in blended finance vehicles. When we started in 2013, that was just not an option. The only thing we could get is for example, a shared loss guarantee with USAID, which was very innovative at that time. But nowadays, I think we have more this first loss, junior tranche, and also TA in certain areas. Africa is still lagging behind, especially the Congo Basin, which remains the only sink on earth. We need TA, we need a junior tranche and blended vehicles to help catalyze and indeed bring along those investors as well who are still on the sidelines. And again, I think for corporates, they have a natural exposure, so I think it makes total sense to move. They also can have a longer term horizon. As Rachael said, we do see this kind of 20-30 year horizon, which is still very difficult for financial investors. And however, we need those more private sector capital, mainstream industries as well to come in to go to the scale needed to address the challenge.
Thank you. Rachael and Nabil, do you want to add anything on the blended finance point?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of ways to think about it. One is, you know, as Edith and Nabil talked about, you know, so this first loss idea and these very long-term investments in, you know, quite challenging countries and projects with you know, a reasonable amount of risk around them. So that's one angle. Then there's another about, you know, who's paying for different services. So, you know, if we're really going to value the full ecosystem services being provided, then, you know, if governments are prepared to put some money in to say, this helps flooding, for example, then great, there's a slice of money going in whatever form to contribute to some attribute that is of value to the government, and then there's other people who want the carbon. I think the other role for, which is not so much a financial one on the government side, is around, you know, setting the rules and regulations and not having a moving target on, you know, how a carbon project's going to be treated, what, you know, forest government rights to carbon, those sorts of things. You know, they're very, very important factors in how investors and corporates look at the long-term risk they're taking on these projects.
Excellent. Thanks for that. And so I think let's move on to the next question, and we can, I think, also pick up a couple of questions from the floor in this as well. So, so this, I was keen to explore a bit more around how corporations can measure the outcomes of these investments, and also if there are any examples of best practice that you see. And one of the questions that's come in is an example around, you know, corporate and an investor working in collaboration to develop a project or fund. And so if anyone's got any thoughts on that specific type of kind of partnership joint venture, then that'd be great too. So we'll start with Edith again.
Okay, great. Well, that's two different. So let's start with the impacts, and I think Rachael also touched upon. So I think in terms of so going back a bit, like certification is, I think, key for maybe from a risk management perspective. We certainly do see on our ESG standard, you know, the minimum certification. If it talks about forestry, you have FSC. If it's about carbon, there are standards. Typically, the Vera, VCS, and CCBS standard has been used as a minimum standard for anything around forest conservation. And what these standards again don't necessarily do is beyond carbon, where you have the CO2 and that can be certified, and you know the impact is can be verified. The rest, other SDGs, are not as developed yet. As impact investors or like fund managers like ourselves, we have our own impact framework, and many others have their own. So I think what we need is certainly more harmonization or a bit more standardization. Also, project developers have their own kind of way, but it's not yet, I think, verified, or again, not yet standardized. And certainly when it comes to biodiversity, it's still more tricky. And you know, you can count some species, you can have camera traps, but I think there is much more needed. So that's what we're also working on, some new tools, new solutions. And in that sense, as an example, I think to mention is Vera's SD Vista standard, which I think is very promising, because under that standard, firstly, you can already kind of try to quantify the more like as an attribute, as like a high quality carbon credit. So for example, you could already, and I think some projects already use it, for example, for watershed services. So you could say it's a high quality carbon credits with some additional benefits for watershed services. And the next step will be, where I see that I think the next few years, certainly next 10 years, there will be a major development, is that new methodologies will be developed that you can actually maybe quantify and become, as Rachael mentioned, also the separate assets on top, which you can stack. So you can start stacking ecosystem services and create additional revenue streams. And that is super needed, because carbon is not going to be enough for certain landscapes and certain type of ecosystems. And certainly there could be some also, let's say, you know, between biodiversity and carbon, some trade-offs. And we certainly need to do that, keep in mind. And that's one of the risks, maybe if I refer back to your first question, that we do see, is that if you just look at it from a carbon perspective, and again, Rachael hinted on that, on the planting side, we do see a big risk that you could end up with a important carbon sequestration project, but messing up the ecosystem services. So I think it will be really nice to see more development on that, and the holistic approach certainly will help. I can stop to let the others also.
Yeah, we'll pick up the example at the end, and I can give you a chance to catch your breath. Sorry, that was two pretty chunky questions at once. Just one quick thing: the standard that you mentioned, I didn't quite catch the name of it.
SD Vista.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
So SD Vista allows you to develop a methodology for specific SDG impacts, and the methodology is then audited and approved, and then you've got, you know, the same measuring, reporting, verification of those standards. So just and independently audited each time. So it's a sort of additional degree of definition and rigor on what most projects will informally report on SDG impacts as well. But this is just a more formal and robust way of doing it. And we're applying it at the moment to an agroforestry project, and yeah, I think it's a good thing to do.
Excellent, thank you.
And we do things like, we work with the London benchmarking group on things like lives improved. How do you quantify lives improved and how do you measure that? And there are, Gold Standard's got an SDG tool as well that we've been working on. So I think people are getting more innovative about how those things are quantified and recorded in general.
And what's your take in terms of is there anything else you'd point to in terms of best practice around this beyond what we've already talked about?
Well, I'm just looking at the other question that's popped into the box about non-native forestry and biodiversity,
sure,
which is a great question, because one of the challenges, particularly on the removal side, is how do you get scale? We talk to a lot of clients, they want lots of removal carbon in time. And of course, a lot of projects today have been relatively smaller projects, and partly because there hasn't been the demand driver and people haven't been prepared to pay, and that's changing dramatically now. So projects will get bigger, but looking at more plantation type forestry is going to be a part of the mix, and of course that is fraught with danger in terms of resilience and biodiversity. And so I think we would tend to look at things like FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, and those sorts of additional standards, which of course have been really important in forming all of the carbon standards as well, to make sure things are done in a balanced way. Now, I've personally have changed my view on plantations. We would all like to have native tree planting, but it's much slower, carbon and very, very expensive, bluntly. And the world needs timber. And I think the point at which I sort of changed my stance on this was when I understood that only 20% of our world's timber comes from plantations of industrial timber. Well, it's coming from somewhere else if it's not coming from plantations. So, and world demand for timber is rising, and as a material, it's got a number of advantages, of course, over some other perhaps more carbon intensive materials. So, I think we have to be open to doing that, but as the person asking the question is alluding to, we just need to be very careful about it's right tree, right place. Have we got enough? Have we taken into consideration all of the other factors around it?
Thank you, Rachael. And Nabil, what's your take on that? In terms of outcomes?
Ian, just to go back on that, just also to pick up on the previous question on the blended finance. I think this was important too, because one of the questions was that it's good to have an insurance, but investment, there is also financial returns, and how much that could impact the financial return. So where we are going also headed is the same way that Edith has said earlier, that the blended finance space is still there. There is a big push from the public sectors that are trying to support more into blended finance, the DFIs. So this will continue, in my view, to help out, especially in the developing countries moving forward. As on the biodiversity and for ourselves also, I think, definitely it's extremely important on every project that we are reviewing that they do include that element, biodiversity, or we include the element of, we look at the FSC certification. We make sure that these projects are following proper environmental and social safeguards guidelines, and we impose certain KPIs and reporting requirements and monitoring schemes that we follow through all these investments. We are really agnostic on basically plantations, or be it a natural forest. Of course, natural forest is the preservation. As for plantation, and we, as Rachael mentioned, that we still need to get the timber, and the plantation seems to be one way to also fulfill that role. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. So let's move on to the final question, and this is where I was keen just to kind of delve into the breadth of experience we have on the panel, looking at kind of some, hopefully, picking up some key observations around how you've seen this space develop over the periods of times that you've looked at it. And obviously, we're at a key point in time, potentially even kind of the maximum interest, but then what that will then mean around how that extrapolates in terms of the next 3, 5, 10 years is how you've seen the space developing, and what that means is inevitably more corporates seek to make investments in this space.
Okay, so I can jump on, and maybe that actually links a bit back to the previous question around blending also different sources of capital. I think we do see, so as we discussed already, so we do see corporates coming also in the investment space. Corporates typically like to have dedicated solutions. So for example, the L'Oreal fund is also like a dedicated solution. However, there is a need, and I think there will be growing space for pooling these investments. And actually, corporates and carbon-based investments can mix quite well with financial return investments. That's also a blended finance model. And I think on our side, we're definitely seeing interest for that and working on solutions. So I think hopefully that's one of the trends that it will be going in the future. I think compared to individual corporate solutions, a pooled approach is interesting for diversification, for scale. There are many benefits as well. And it's to the question, yes, it's possible to have a share class where you give the return on carbon credits and some others in financial returns. It requires a careful structuring upfront. Of course, you have to avoid conflict of interest, etc. But again, I think that's a great solution. And as I mentioned, I think corporate type of investments is a little bit different profile. We have seen they could be a bit more patient capital, a bit more risk takers, longer term. So again, it blends very well with private sector financial capital. We do see the financial industry, I think, as well coming. They also have footprint. They're also working on their net zero strategies. So I expect this space to indeed grow significantly. We're looking forward to seeing again all these commitments to transform into action on the ground.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Rachael, what's your saying?
Yeah, but I think building on that point about the sort of investors and corporates, I think one area I can see gaining some traction is, and I spent a little bit of my career in solar power, and I can see similar models there, that if you've got corporates, this is about people taking the risk that they're best equipped to take. So can you get corporates making long-term commitments, which is in the end, they want to get the carbon credits they pay for, but backed by creditworthy corporate counterparties, then investors can come in and take that early risk. So for example, on planting projects, you've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years where there's money going in and no carbon coming out. But you've got investors have then at least got visibility on as long as the credits come, they've got visibility on that revenue stream. So I think that's an area that we're certainly exploring and sort of having quite a few discussions around at the moment. I think one of the other things that's going to happen over I say next few years, very, very near next few years, is just there's going to be a lot of competition for the best projects, and particularly removals projects, and a challenge to scale those up in an immature industry, which is always interesting. One of the immediate effects I see is corporates require high standards. They require high standards on human rights, supply chain standards, etc., bribery and corruption. And a lot of the people, a lot of the project implementers, that's kind of an alien world for them. Some of them are better than others, but I think there's going to be a whole lifting of those sorts of standards alongside, there are some, DCF, Gold Standard, there are some great carbon standards that do encompass more than just carbon. I think we'll see those continue to get more and more robust, and they'll get more robust with you know, innovation in monitoring and measuring and so on. You know, that there's lots of people putting, you know, their brains to work in that space, you know, improving data quality, reducing costs. I think, you know, all of this is just creating, it sort of lifts the bar for everyone, and it'll bring innovation in around it, because there is money going into the end product. And I think, you know, obviously a lot of push for more standardization and the, you know, the Mark Carney task force and so on. You know, which I would cautiously welcome, but at the same time, I'm always sit there saying we're very far from this being a commodity. You know, the one thing you can be sure of is you've got 1 ton of carbon dioxide reduction when you get it certified and audited, et cetera, but the projects, what happens around them and the cost of delivering them and the benefits of them, you know, they're not a one size fits all. And I think that's kind of the dilemma there in terms of standardization.
Excellent, thank you, Rachael. And Nabil, what are your reflections in terms of your perspective on how this space has evolved and where you see it going in the future?
Again, as we started earlier, I think the space is going forward, and that mean forward is going to grow, and you're going to see more investments in that space that are coming. We are seeing a lot of corporate that are coming into that space, and more corporate without like individual investors. They tend to have a much longer tenor, you know, maturity in mind, the way versus investors. Where some investors may be more on the short term and the financial returns that they may have. But from my perspective, I think also I'm seeing there is a combination of both corporate and investors coming into the space together in certain areas. So our view, this will continue, and the standards will continue to be strengthened, and on the investors that are moving forward.
Excellent. Just, one question for me. We've got a couple more minutes, so if anyone else wants to add questions, then please do, and we'll try and cover them. But in terms of looking at the types of corporates that are involved, are there any themes that we could point to there in terms of, you know, which sectors or geographies have been more active, and where there's been less activity, where you'd have thought maybe there will be, or should have been, or will be soon?
Gosh, everybody, I think, is one answer, the simple answer. A lot in financial services, driven by their, you know, imminent disclosure requirements and sort of increasing transparency there. A lot in professional services, a lot in tech, and you get a bit of, you know, we always like to see an announcement from a high-profile brand in a sector, because then everybody feels you know, obliged to pile in and follow. So bring it on. We're always happy with the front runners, but everybody, yeah. I mean, a lot on, I guess, food and beverage are often looking at insetting first and what they can do in their own supply chain. So I think that's been more their focus. But I don't know, Edith, whether you see similar things in terms of sectors.
Yeah, no, definitely tech, supply chain, and then I would say that interestingly, there has been, well, I think we had high hopes for it, like around, you know, the TFA zero deforestation commitments. So some of those corporates, yeah, indeed focusing more on the supply chains, and then I think that they are, yeah, I think they are coming as well now more also, and you know, whether it be the cocoa or hopefully the other, yeah, major driver of deforestation. I mean, beef, palm is a bit more tricky, but yeah, I think they are catching up, and yeah, otherwise it's quite diverse. I think indeed, yeah, financial services are coming as well. So it's there are some are more advanced than others indeed, and then of course the energy sector was the ones first entering, right? So they are those the ones that moved quite quickly upstream. Then you have other drivers like the aviation, obviously, which is driven by kind of a compliance regime behind, but actually the current demand is not coming from compliance. I think it's also interesting to highlight that this is voluntary, but it's voluntary strategic, and it's also because we're in a different world. Like, not Kyoto is very different to the Paris Agreement. I think this voluntary kind of market is set to grow, and we're not really in this compliance versus voluntary where we used to be. If I have 1 minute, I would also like to comment on, because I have seen some of the questions indeed still around these plantations. I do agree. I think it's, from our perspective, it's quite, yeah, we need to be very careful. And I totally agree with some comments in the chat that when it comes to, timber or, resources, we need plantations. But I think when it comes to maybe net zero targets, and especially again, the biodiversity targets, we do see that it's very important to favor always native species and not monocultures. And then there's this big issue around planting versus natural technique, restoration techniques, which are actually much less expensive. And so I would caveat that I think it's very important to think about, if you need a plantation, you put in a place which is not of a high environmental or ecosystem service importance. Fine, you can plant something for timber, but it might not be the one which we're talking about here. Natural climate solutions, we would always favor native species, high biodiversity angle. And just to give a very concrete example, there is a big current stake around mangroves ecosystems, where we have seen a lot of projects being restored, planted, without restoring ecosystem services coming with it. Very dangerous game. So we wouldn't like to be involved in that kind of carbon kind of projects. But again, I agree, we need a really lot of solution, and plantation is part of the mix to solve the problem.
Excellent. Well, thank you to all our panelists. That was fascinating and very, very interesting to get your views on those topics. And we're coming up to lunch now, so I won't keep anyone longer from their lunch. And enjoy the rest of the day.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.